My name is Adrian Gonzalez. I am president of Adelante, and welcome to today's MindPick session, where Adelante members can pick the minds of noted academics, business leaders, and other executives in both the field of supply chain management and leadership development. And it's my pleasure today to welcome John J. Brown, who is the Director of Risk Management Supply Chain at the Coca-Cola Company. And John has worked in the risk management field for over a decade, and indirectly in the field for most of his career. John is also currently serving as the chairperson of the Supply Chain Risk Leadership Council, which is a group of industry professionals that are develop supply chain risk management standards and best practices. So, John, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, Adrian.
Before we get started, just for members that are joining us live, just remember that you can ask questions anytime via the chat feature. So I will, keep my eyes on that to see if any new questions come up. So, John, before we kind of dive into the topic at hand here, I'm kind of curious to learn a little bit more about your background. How you got started in the risk management field. Tell us a little bit about your career journey. Ending up at Coca-Cola right now, and what your current role and focus is there at Coca-Cola.
Really good question. I think a lot of risk managers typically take the career route of starting out in insurance and areas like that, and working into broader areas of risk management. My path took a little bit different course. So I started out as an electrical engineer, and actually designed things in the power area, transmission lines, distribution lines, machinery, things like that. Quite interesting. I started with an affiliate of the H.J. Heinz Company in 1989, which was my introduction into industry, as a project engineer. And shortly after I started with the company, they had an environmental disaster at one of the plants. So I was asked to lead a group for both energy and environmental. I started getting into the risk areas on the environmental side way back in the very early 90s. And with Heinz, and I did spend 17 years of my career with Heinz, moved on into taking responsibility for worker safety, for food safety, for asset conservation, which is just protecting property, and also spent a couple of years in the insurance area for Heinz. The last 5 years there, I was handling operational risk globally for the company, and we were making moves into enterprise risk management. I was recruited away from Heinz by a semiconductor company. Looked like a fantastic career opportunity, and it was for the 7 months that they had the position open. So, after going from a 17-year stable career with a great company like H.J. Heinz, going to what looked like a fantastic opportunity, I hadn't done enough risk research in the semiconductor industry, and they go through some significant cycles. And unfortunately, within a few months after I started with the company, they were on a deep dive into one of those really low cycles, and decided that the position they'd hired me for was no longer needed. So the good news is I ended up at Coca-Cola from there. Started with Coke about 4 years ago with the charge to develop and deploy a risk management process across the company's extended supply chain. And that's then more several times to where it's now supply chain in all technical areas for the company. So in a nutshell, that's sort of how my career took the journey.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, my background is I'm an engineer as well, and I started my career in the semiconductor industry. So I know too well the ups and downs of that industry. Do you see kind of the risk management, and particularly supply chain risk management, is that a growing position at many companies, or is it still a fairly new concept organizationally for companies?
I just had to turn my computer back on. I think it's getting a lot more airtime now. In the past few years, especially last year with the Japan earthquake and the Thailand floods, exposed a lot of what I would consider weaknesses in supply chains that many companies didn't really realize existed. With all the regulatory scrutiny on other areas of risk, including the financial arena, I think the outlook for risk managers is relatively bright for the next 2 years. Now, the thing about risk management is that it's starting a risk management program is like starting an exercise program. You normally don't do it because you're doing it for the benefits that will come years later. You're doing it typically in reaction to something. And that's why I say right now that the future is bright for risk managers. And that will last as long as people remember the pain of the disruptions that we've felt over the past couple of years. So I'm not wishing for continued disruptions and continued disasters, but it does keep the focus on risk management as a critical discipline for companies.
Great. Well, great intro. Let's dive into a little bit now into supply chain risk management and risk management. And I'm going to start off with just a very basic question, but I think it's an important one. What is supply chain risk management, and how do you define that? Is there a standard definition? And what is the difference between, let's say, risk management and kind of another term that you hear a lot in the industry, supply chain resiliency? Are they the same thing? Are they complementary to each other? So, your thoughts on that?
A couple of good questions. I think if you get 10 people in a room and ask them to define supply chain risk management, you're going to get 12 different definitions. There is no solid defined definition for it. To some people, it means just your supplies coming in to your company. To others, including a lot of my thinking over the years, and here at Coca-Cola now, we think of supply chain as all the way from basic ingredient suppliers all the way through conversion and getting the product out into our consumers' hands, and even beyond that. What do we do with the packaging beyond that? So supply chain is likened more like value chain today. And I think a lot more companies are starting to adopt it that way. It's not just people and companies providing materials to your own company. It's rather what do you do with those, and then how do you get finished product or service out to customers and consumers. The term resiliency is, I think some consultants probably started it, and no offense to you, Adrian, but consultants are really good at coming up with words that resonate emotionally with people, and resiliency does that. I mean, you can envision a palm tree swaying in the wind and bending in a hurricane, gale force wind, and then comes back. So that's resiliency. And there really is no difference in risk management and resiliency. It's the same thing, or it should result in the same thing. I think that's what's happened, and I may be getting into some additional questions, I'm not sure, but I think what's happened is that over the years, especially the last decade, a lot of companies have worked really hard to lean up supply chains, to squeeze out every bit of cost, just in time, single source supplier. And that works good as long as everything is stable. As soon as something goes wrong, you start realizing that we have all the good work we did to squeeze out costs have resulted in what I call a brittle supply chain. Something breaks, and you can't just go back and fix it easily. It's broken. So I think that's where the term resiliency comes from, and resiliency means preventing something from happening or being able to recover quickly when something happens. Good supply chain risk management does the same thing.
Good. I mean, I think it's good to kind of have that. I think you're right. I think if you've got 10 people in a room and ask them to define these terms, you'll probably get at least 10 different definitions. When I think of risk management, at a very high level, I think of kind of two phases. One is kind of the ability to identify different risks that your company or your supply chain is exposed to, and then try to quantify what the potential impact would be to your company. And then after that, being able to then develop, response plans or action plans for each of those risks. In your experience, both directly involved in this industry as well as your role working with other, practitioners, which part, if any, do companies struggle with the most? Is it the assessment part, trying to figure out what the risks are and quantifying them, or is it more on the developing the action plans?
Well, Adrian, I think they're both equally difficult. Or not the risk identification itself, because that's typically rather the fun part of risk management. What's difficult is keeping that risk identification and risk analysis live. Most companies I work for have done many good spot and time risk assessments. typically in reaction to some event. And a lot of good work done there. What happens, though, is that a couple of action items may be put in place from that risk assessment, but then nothing's done. So you're back in the same place 2 years, 3 years down the road and doing another great spot and time risk assessment. The key is to keep that live, and I think that's where companies struggle. Another problem.
So it's really not it's not really like, hey, we did our risk assessment and we're good for the next 5 years.
Yeah. It's typically like a company will have a quality problem. So a lot of good work to go in and understand why. Root cause analysis, understand what all goes on or what went wrong. Not realizing that risk is dynamic. Companies are dynamic. Things change all the time, and therefore risk management has to be applied. So that's on the analysis or the identification side. On the analysis, there's another factor that plays in, and this really goes to identification too, is that as human beings, we remember what happened last week much more than what happened last year. So when we do a risk analysis or risk identification, we're biased by what happened in the recent past. It may not be any more relevant, and probably is less relevant than what happened last year, but as humans, we remember it that way. And also when we try to put some numerics or some quantification around the level of risk, we run into the same problem. We're biased. We're biased both by our own path through life as well as more recent events. There's a really good book. It's called How Risky Is It Really? And it goes into some of these emotional factors that go into risk analysis. I highly recommend that any practitioner that does a risk analysis and risk identification understands some of the dynamics about the emotion behind the identification and analysis. When we get to response plans, I've seen, again, throughout my career, typically in response to a business disruption, a lot of time and effort and money it goes into developing really good, really large business continuity plans. And then they sit on a shelf. I've seen 600-page business continuity plans that a lot of good work that went into it. As soon as you put it on the shelf, it's dated. It doesn't stay alive. And in addition, nobody in the midst of a crisis is going to reach up for a 600-page document and try to figure out what to do. So I think companies struggle in the appropriate response to developing a plan when risks are identified.
Now, I would think that, in the assessment side of things, or maybe this is also in developing the action plan, that, on the one hand, there is so much more access to information today and data that you can argue that, it's much easier today, again, to identify risks and to get the information you need to quantify and see where problem areas may arise. But then on the other hand, there's so much many more variables today, I would think, than in the past. And you also have, the opposite problem of too much information. How do you sift through all that to kind of, find the real valuable information from all the noise? Do you agree with that? That with kind of the way I'm looking at that?
I agree. It's a double-edged sword. The more information you have to work with, the better off your decision should be. The problem nowadays, as you pointed out, is that there's too much information. You don't know what's relevant and what's not relevant. I think this has really been heightened by social media these days, where everybody has an opinion. You can go find anything you want on the internet. Whether or not it's right is another question. But having good data is really great when you're trying to understand where you should be focusing your efforts. But finding the nuggets of the right information among the snowstorm of data points out there is difficult.
Now, you mentioned the Japan earthquake and the Thailand floods, and certainly that brought this whole topic to the forefront again for a lot of executives in the industry. And obviously those events disrupted the operations of many companies. And it seems to me that it's these type of operational risks that get the most attention, obviously from the media. But I would think that maybe with some companies too. I know in reading some of your writings, you talk about the importance of not only thinking about operational risks, but also thinking about and identifying strategic risks. Such as a new competitor entering the field, or technological shift taking place, or things of that nature. When I look at a company like Kodak, and kind of the rise of digital cameras and what's happened there, you can see what's happened to the company today. Same thing with, with Borders and the entry of Amazon and ebooks and things of that nature. So I think those are kind of relevant examples that are kind of making the news today. Are there differences in how, companies assess and respond to strategic risks versus operational risks? And if so, what are some of the differences?
Well, I would say that the way I like to look at things is separate the strategic risk from the operational risk is think of your company as a ship out on the ocean. And what you're looking at over the horizon is your destination, your look at success. And that's your strategic direction. And it's important to know what is out there in that vast ocean that could disrupt your ability to reach your destination. So that's where this new technology comes in, where other players come in. We've seen some pretty disruptive events in a lot of different industries based on development. So it's important to understand those. The other things that are more strategic are how do you deal with events like economic meltdowns and socio-political disruptions, which can happen, and you need to be aware of because it could drastically change your strategic plan. So I would say that dealing with strategic risks, you're looking at it from a more long-term view, and your responses to that are going to be more long-term and more overarching for the entire company. On the other hand, operational risks are what keeps the ship moving, the machinery down on the belly of the ship that's keeping it going forward. Anything that goes wrong with that, of course, you're still not going to be able to meet your destination because you're not moving. So I see them both as being important. You have to be headed in the right direction, and operationally, you have to be able to keep moving. It doesn't do any good to be moving but going in the wrong direction or into an iceberg. And likewise, it doesn't do any good if you know where you're going but you can't move. So responses to operational risks are typically shorter term in nature, but equally important. I think the strategic risks are the ones that are more difficult to deal with because a lot of times we're in denial, such as Kodak or the digital world. They never figured or believed that digital photography would supplant film just based on quality issues. But technical advances in semiconductors easily overtook that.
Yeah, I had the strategic risks are of particular interest to me because, like I mentioned earlier, I started my career in the semiconductor industry, specifically at Motorola, and I think they were the company on the cell phone side that hit some bumps in the road because they missed the boat on the transition from analog to digital back when I was working there, and they also then years later missed the boat again in the transition from traditional phones to smartphones, right? So they've always had to play, catch up. And I also had the pleasure of working at Polaroid for a short stint. So there's another company that was kind of in denial of kind of what the future of digital photography was going to do to the company. But along the same lines, are there? And I know this might be, it might be hard to kind of generalize here, but are there some types of risks or specific risks that you see companies commonly kind of perhaps inadvertently overlook? They may, if they were to write down the risk, they may focus on one type but completely kind of, for whatever reason overlook some other types. And with you specifically, are there some types of risks that are on your radar screen today that maybe weren't there, 5, 6 years ago?
I think a couple of classic examples are first one is social media. Who would have guessed that social media and the speed with which opinions travel can have such a big impact on companies? I don't remember the name of it, but there was some company recently that made a decision to not fund some other, I forget what it was, some kind of a charitable organization. And that resulted in just a whole load of public outcry across social media. And that company had to backpedal quickly, and I don't think they really recovered fully from it. They lost a lot of their funding base because a lot of the people who were donating to that original company were so disenchanted with their decision that they quit funding it. So
that was the Susan B. Komen and Planned Parenthood.
okay, thank you. I was struggling to remember what that was.
I think the other example is even Verizon, and that they were planning to change their fees. I think it was, and again, they reversed course quickly when they when social media took over and the outrage was loud.
Yeah, when you're facing mass exodus of your customer base, you typically want to react quickly. The good news is that you can react quickly, but what would be great is to be able to understand the impact of your decision on the general consumer base. I think a lot of the banks went through that too when they were starting to talk about having transaction fees. So people have a voice now, and it happens. I think we may see a return to some of the wargaming that went on, scenario planning. Shell Oil was really a leader in that field about 20 years ago. I think they probably still are, but if you don't hear about it, it's not. So I think the whole social media space is changing the way we go to market, the way we think about it, the way we filter our decisions to try to understand what kind of impact they might have. I think another risk that has come to the forefront based on the Japan earthquake and the Thailand floods is how our supply chains are constructed. And the fact that some companies, and I think Cisco is a leader in this, are able to map all the way through their tier one suppliers and understand how value flows through their system, both the nodes and the links. So they know where value is concentrated, and they also know where they have to have some pretty robust backup plans. However, I think very few companies, if any, can map through the tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4 suppliers. And if you take a look at what happened as a result of the Japan earthquake, most of the pain that companies felt were not from their direct tier 1 suppliers. There were a couple of leaps up the supply chain from that. So the challenge is, how do we get a good visual picture of what our supply chains look like, understand the value flows, and therefore understand where we need to have some backup plans in place in case something does go wrong. I think that's another big challenge that is still developing, because it is such a challenge, so nobody really wants to wrestle with it. It's like starting off climbing Mount Everest with a pair of tennis shoes on. So I think another couple that risks that are becoming more important now are water and energy. Water has been likened as the next oil. It's a scarce resource, and of course, as a beverage company, we're very concerned about that because most of our product is water. So fortunately, the company for a long time, and I think Coke's a leader in this, has put together some really good plans around the globe to manage water and reduce what we ourselves use. So I think it's been good for the entire global community. I think another one that is becoming more apparent, and I think will increase in the next few years, is the economic and the socio-political upheavals. We're still dealing with the pain from Europe, and I just read today where both Europe and China now, and China's the most worrisome one, manufacturing levels have gone down. So that's a real concern, right? From a general global economic viewpoint. The Arab Spring that happened about a year ago, we'll probably see more of that as the general quality of life and economic level of people around the world increases. They start wanting more. They're less tolerant of governments and other institutions of using heavy-handed approach. So I think we'll see more of that in the next few years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you raised some really important ones. I mean, the one that resonates with me is particularly, in industries that are very heavily outsourced or very dispersed. Is trying to find that one weak link, perhaps. And you're right, that weak link could be 2 or 3 tiers, up the supply chain. And the one that comes to mind was it wasn't related to recent events, but I think it was Boeing a few years back, where as they were building the Dreamliner, they discovered they had a shortage of nuts and bolts, and that was becoming the constraint in kind of their whole project timeline. And it was something as simple as, nuts and bolts, because there were specialized items. They were single sourced, I believe. I forget all the details, but it really came down to that.
I read a case study on Boeing and the issue, and I think it had to do with rivets, and in very specialized rivets. It's not like you just can get a source of rivets. There are very specialized rivets based on shear strength and other parameters. And it was interesting to understand how many rivets actually are in airplanes. I think the 737 has, if I remember correctly, but don't quote me on this, it's on the range of 400,000 rivets in that airplane.
Wow.
And if I remember right, the 747 had there's over a million rivets. So, and they're specialized. If you don't have the right ones for the leading end of the wing, you're not going to build the airplane.
Right. Yeah, and you see that, again, with a lot of these high-tech, products or automotive, it could be something as simple as a, rivet or some wiring or whatever the case might be.
Go ahead. Some of the more recent information that's been out on Toyota in their analysis of what happened during the Japan earthquake and why they felt so much pain, they did quite a bit of work to understand their supply chain, and they found out that it's not so much a pyramid like this, but rather barrel shaped. So there may be a tier 3 supplier that supplies a couple of the tier 1 suppliers. So that tier 3 supplier can have an impact on 2 of your tier 1 suppliers. So I think that's an interesting analysis too that a lot of other companies may be facing too without realizing it.
It seems to me that a prerequisite for a lot of companies is really coming up with that putting the work involved to really map out kind of all the components and what components go into what products and which suppliers are involved, and then taking it a step further, where are those suppliers located, and then what's the financial stability of those suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it just goes into so many different angles.
There's some really good work being done on that. I had some contact with an MIT professor who's been running a project to mine data from company systems and visually construct that supply chain map. You'd think that would be easy. The difficulty they've run into is that purchase orders will identify the company that you buy the material from, and typically it's their office location. It does not capture the ship from, ship to addresses. So you're not really able to construct your supply chain. And they've gone back and they're capturing some of that data with a couple of companies they're working with. And I'm relatively hopeful that there's a lot of smart minds at MIT. I'm relatively hopeful they'll come up with a way sooner or later to be able to reach into the data systems of companies and be able to visually map out supply chain. That's
great. Yeah, thank you. That's a interesting, some interesting work being done. I think I would envision that would be a challenging, task for many companies. But let's talk about the kind of the human side of this, right? From an organization, standpoint. How do you address supply chain risk management organizationally? I mean, who's involved, or ideally who should be involved, and what should their roles and responsibilities be?
It's a really good question, and I think the fundamentals of risk management stay the same. How you apply that across the company depends both on the company's business structure and the company's culture. And it just, although the fundamentals stay the same, you have to be flexible on how you apply it. The ideal way to implement a risk management program in supply chain is, again, to map out your supply chain, understand the value flows, and therefore you understand where your critical points are and you focus your efforts there. In many companies, that's not possible because the business structure is so complex or so large or disconnected, you can't do that. That was a challenge I ran into at Coca-Cola, was being able to, or not being able to map out the many value chains in the company. So the approach we took was to develop a common process that matched the way the company does business and the culture, and then deploy that process at every level and entity within the company globally. We're still on that journey. At a minimum, You make sure by doing this that risks are identified and managed locally, which is great. The sweet spot comes when you're able to use some technology to start aggregating risks horizontally and vertically throughout the company, so you can understand where you have common risks and therefore be able to better deploy company resources to mitigate those risks. And I don't know if that answers the question, but there's no easy answer to it.
Right, but in your experience in working with, particularly, let's say, with the Supply Chain Risk Management Leadership Council, do companies typically have a point person, someone like yourself, who's a director or a VP of risk? Is it more of a cross-functional type of responsibility? I mean, who does the team or the individual report to? What kind of where do the lines of responsibility and communication go through?
Yeah, my experience, both personally and with other companies in the Supply Chain Risk Leadership Council, is it tends to be fairly dispersed throughout the company. You have one area or department worried about security aspects of supply chain. Another one will be focused on business continuity. Another one will be focused on incident management and crisis resolution. Procurement will typically have its own systems in place to mitigate procurement risks, both cost and availability. So I think from my experience and what I've seen so far, risk management across value chains is still very silo-oriented. And it works, but it could work so much better if we're able to cut across those silos.
Right. Now, kind of related to this, and you talked about earlier in terms of risk management being kind of a living, breathing kind of process. The whole question of governance, putting a governance structure around this, whether it's a very organized function or if it's more of a cross-functional, siloed, approach. I think having some kind of structure or framework to work around would help in that effort. Are there any frameworks that companies can use? Any standards in this area that companies can use as kind of a starting point for this?
I haven't seen anything that works real well yet. I think there's some good concepts around this governance, risk, and compliance framework. The way I view it, risk management identifies and mitigates or treats risks. Governance is where you put in place policies and procedures that are used to then govern people's behavior and therefore mitigate some of the risks that have been identified. Compliance is the arm that audits and makes sure that those policies and procedures are adhered to. I see it as a mutually dependent triangle: governance, risk, and compliance. Where does this start? Where does it end? Chicken and egg question. There's no right answer.
Okay. Now, you mentioned kind of technology before when you were giving the example of Coca-Cola and what you guys are doing there in terms of the role that sounds like you're using some technology to help in terms of being able to identify risks or opportunities that you can leverage across the business units and across different teams. Again, from your experience, either at Coca-Cola or what you see other companies doing, what's the role of technology here? Or what kind of tools are available to folks that can help them with the assessment process, with the plan development process, or any part of this, to be able to do it in a more cost-effective, efficient manner?
Right. Yes. Excel, of course, is the preferred favorite. And people still use Excel quite a bit for analysis and tracking. And
I think Excel is the most used tool in every single business process there is.
And unfortunately, it introduces a level of risk in itself in a tool like that. Excel I have found to be almost impossible to use when you're trying to aggregate risks across the company, if the company has any scope of size to it. The key factor that I like to keep in mind is get the risk management process right first. Make sure you get the process developed, that it works, that it matches the company's business structure and culture. You get that right first. And then start looking for some technology to help support that process. I see too many companies and too many people going out and being wowed by some great software for risk management, and then trying to fit their company into that software product. It's just like the old saying that if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So
right.
To me, it's extremely critical to get the process right first, and then use technology. A company of any size is going to have multiple value chains and multiple business units that are responsible for risk. So I think it becomes very critical to be able to aggregate and do some analysis on risks across the company's value chains. And technology, I think, is going to play an increasingly important role in doing that.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier when we started the conversation in terms of, are you seeing more focus in this area by companies one of the, I think, the proof points, the data points that there is heightened interest in this is when you see the number of startup companies, software vendors or other technologies that are focused in this area. And certainly the past couple of years, I've come across at least a couple of companies that are developing technologies, to help companies either get a more complete look of their supply chain, to draw those maps you were talking about, or to be able to help, aggregate data and facilitate the communication between the different stakeholders involved to try to, again, make this a living, breathing process as opposed to, a 600-page document that, sits somewhere and nobody looks at. So I think whenever you see entrepreneurs launching software companies and venture capitalists putting money into it, there's a need out there for them to be doing that. So
yes, absolutely.
So as a way to kind of wrap up, I've got just a couple of more questions, and I guess to try to sum things up in terms of what companies ought to look for. How would you complete this sentence? You have a sound risk management process and organization if what? Are there 2, 3, 4, 5 attributes that if an executive or company were to do a self-assessment, what are some of those things that they should be looking for to say, okay, we do have a sound, or we're at least on the way to having a sound process in this area?
I've always told myself and others that I would consider my effort successful if my job wasn't needed. Well, you've reached the journey when your role is no longer needed, and I think that really is true. If risk management is successful in a company, it's not something that a person or a group does off in a corner and comes back once in a while with a report. When risk management is successful, it's part of the way the business is run. Risks are identified, analyzed, and actions taken upon the risks, just as a part of doing business, part of every business meeting, part of every decision that's made. So to me, that's the key to the successful risk management program. We've developed a risk management maturity model here that we're using to guide or to try to put some metrics behind how mature risk management is in different parts of the organization. And there's 5 key areas of that. The first one is management commitment. If your senior leaders aren't behind this, you're wasting your time. Don't two ways about it. The second is, do you have solid frameworks and tools in place to help identify, analyze, and treat risks? The third one is having risk assessment processes. Do you have processes, formalized, written, documented processes that help you analyze risks? And then the fourth area is, what about risk treatment processes? And there are common ones like business continuity plans that every company should have. There are other ones that are going to be unique based on the risk itself. And the fifth and final one is, are there procedures in place for ongoing monitoring, communicating, and review? So those are 5 areas that we've keyed in on. It's aligned somewhat to the ISO 31000 standard, which I think is one of the best standards that's ever been developed in the area of risk management. So that's our way of trying to understand and measure the level of risk management effectiveness within the company.
Now, what I didn't hear there, and maybe it's just kind of embedded in each of those to some extent, is the people side of things. I mean, is there active, in terms of training for different roles within the organization. Is risk kind of a component of kind of the way you develop different individuals and different functions within your company?
Yeah, education or training is, you're right, it's embedded in what I just highlighted, but it is a critical part. Risk management, even though it seems like it's relatively simple, put some framework around it and put some brackets around it is definitely not easy. And training is a definite part, especially if you want to embed risk management within business process. It's a good catch.
Great. So we've got time for just one more question, right? So I'll end it with this. For everyone listening, either live today or, like we said, we're recording today's session so our members can listen to it on demand. Why should supply chain executives care about risk management? And after listening, to today's session, what things should they put on their to-do list? Do you recommend to kind of get started in this area?
That's a really good question, and the bottom line is that if you don't have a supply chain, if you don't have a way to get materials, convert materials, and get them to your customers, whether they be tangible products or services, you have no business. So that's why supply chain risk and risk management is so important. The difficulty, of course, is that when things are running smoothly, you don't understand there's problems, so your focus becomes on squeezing costs out. But I think the recent events have highlighted that there are significant risks in supply chain. And one thing I failed to mention earlier on is the global connectedness of supply chain. What happens in China can and does affect what happens in Europe, in the U.S., and Latin America. So we're all connected. But the bottom line is that if you don't have a supply chain, if you don't have a functioning value chain, you have nothing to offer as a company, so therefore you have no company. That's why it's important. But I think that some focus areas of companies should put in place now are, if you don't have a formal risk management process, that's a continuous living process, start developing one and implement it. It's a journey. It's definitely not easy, but that's the first step. The second thing is map out, to the extent you can, your value chain. You understand where you have concentrated risk, either in nodes or in the linkages, and therefore be able to focus your resources in the best possible way. And then one thing is sort of a self-serving plug is there is a supply chain risk leadership council to the collective intelligence of the member companies has developed a supply chain risk management best practices guide that I think it's about 80% in my view, but it does a good job of laying out what goes into a risk management program and what some of the common treatment plans are: business continuity, emergency response, incident crisis management.
Great, and you shared with us that document, which we're making available to our members, so they'll be able to kind of download that and read that. So thank you, and thank you, John. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us your thoughts, experience, and ideas around this topic. We will be continuing the conversation both online. So I just want to remind our members that the conversation doesn't end here. We will be able to continue this conversation, supply chain risk management, online via the discussion forum. So if you've got questions for John or one another, why don't you post them on the discussion forum? We'll make sure that John has access to the discussion forum, be able to continue to contribute his thoughts and be able to answer those questions. And then secondly, for those of you attending the Adelante breakout meeting in June, supply chain risk management is going to be one of the key sessions that we'll have there. So that's yet another opportunity for us to keep the conversation going. John, again, thank you very much. You and I had the opportunity to talk beforehand, and for those of you who do not know John, he is an avid marathoner, and he and his wife will be running the Boston Marathon here in just a few weeks. So since I live in the area, I'll be out there cheering you on, and best of luck to you and your wife on the 26.2 mile journey.
Thank you. It's a nice trip.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, and for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you for the next session.